This time on Crime Inc., the terror of September 11. The U-2 spy plane incident. Jockey's tax fraud lands him in jail. And a Caribbean cricket mystery. But first, the princes in the tower. When Shakespeare wrote his histories of the Plantagenet kings, he depicted Richard III as a depraved, tormented hunchback who murdered his two nephews so he could claim the throne of England. But subsequent research has thrown doubt on Shakespeare's version of history. Richard's brother, Edward IV, fathered two sons with wife Elizabeth Woodville, with Edward the Elder becoming king upon his death in 1483. But 2 months later, Richard seized the throne and declared the children illegitimate, on the grounds that Edward had been secretly betrothed to another woman at the time of his marriage to Elizabeth. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were kept in the Tower of London, where they became known as the Princes in the Tower. Richard's reign was tumultuous and bloody, characterized by power struggles within the deeply divided houses of York and Lancaster. The two boys were seen as pawns in the race for power, as well as potential rivals. But having already established their illegitimacy, Richard had far less reason to murder them than certain other figures. Not only that, but Elizabeth Woodville returned to court voluntarily in 1484 and allowed her 6 daughters to mix with Richard's retinue, a surprising act if the king had indeed ordered the murder of her only sons. Richard's kingship lasted only 3 years before Henry Tudor gathered enough support to invade England and defeat the Yorkist forces at the Battle of Bosworth, where Richard died in combat. Henry proclaimed himself Henry VII and took Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, as his bride, uniting York and Lancaster in the House of Tudor. But there was no sign of Elizabeth's little brothers. If they were already dead, suspects include would-be kingmaker, the Duke of Buckingham, and John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Surprisingly, Henry made no accusations of murder against Richard when he put a bill to Parliament detailing the former king's alleged crimes to justify his own grab for power. In fact, Henry Tudor had more motive than anyone to do away with the little princes. By marrying their sister, he was re-establishing the legitimacy of Edward's children. If they were alive, both boys had a far greater claim on the throne than he. In the first few years of his reign, Henry VII executed a number of Edward IV's nephews, who as Yorkist heirs posed a direct threat to his kingship. Rumors grew that the boys were dead, but it was another 16 years before Richard was directly implicated in their murder. In 1501, James Tyrrell was arrested for supporting a Yorkist rebellion. Under torture, he claimed he had killed the boys at Richard's behest. In 1674, workmen uncovered 2 bodies buried in a box at the Tower of London. In case they were the prince's remains, Charles II had them reinterred in Westminster Abbey. In 1933, the bones were examined, but doctors were unable to conclusively determine their age or sex. As the years passed, public opinion swung towards Richard, and many people argued for his vindication. In 1997, a mock trial presided over by 3 American Supreme Court justices found Richard not guilty of murdering his nephews. For many years, the landmark Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center were the pride of the city, a hub of American power and a symbol of the country's economic dominance. But on September the 11th, 2001, this world came crashing down when terrorists attacked both the towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The first sign of trouble was the smoke that billowed from the North Tower at 8:45 a.m. after American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston ripped a huge hole in the building, setting it ablaze. New Yorkers realized it wasn't just a horrible accident when another airliner, United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston, careered into the side of the South Tower. Both buildings quickly became infernos, with trapped people yelling for help. Many opted to leap to their death rather than die in the fire. News cameras broadcast the attacks live around the world to a stunned audience. 40 minutes later, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into U.S. military headquarters at the Pentagon, killing 184 people. Emergency crews raced to secure the scene and evacuate thousands of workers. A fourth hijacked jet crashed into a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. It was later discovered that passengers and crew had heard of the other attacks and chose to take on the hijackers, who deliberately crashed the aircraft when they realized they were about to be overpowered. It was later revealed that the flight was en route to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., America's seat of power. Back in New York, emergency services scrambled to help the injured. People watched the scenes unfolding in disbelief, astounded that their city could be the target of such an act. As people stranded above the impact point realized they might not escape, hundreds of poignant emails, texts, and phone calls were sent to loved ones. Those who could made their way down the emergency stairs, descending as many as 80 levels to reach the ground. The smell of jet fuel scorched their throats, and the exhausting journey took almost an hour from the top levels. They were met by rescuers going up the stairs to help survivors on the upper levels. The structural damage to the buildings was so intense that at 10:05 a.m. the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, producing a massive cloud of dust and debris. Hundreds of rescue workers were buried. 20 minutes later, the North Tower collapsed, releasing an enormous billow of debris and smoke that blanketed downtown Manhattan and forced people to flee for their lives. Bewildered and bloody, survivors staggered from the scene while emergency services battled to rescue survivors. But the danger wasn't over. The 47-story 7 World Trade building collapsed at 5:20 that afternoon. America was plunged into shock. How could several planes be hijacked at the same time? Who was responsible for carrying out the attacks? And why would anyone set out to kill and injure so many innocent people? U.S. authorities identified the hijackers as supporters of Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda network, blamed for attacks on American interests around the world, from embassies in Africa to the USS Cole in Yemen. Investigators established that a total of 19 hijackers on 4 planes carried out the intricate, well-financed plan to attack America at its core. Knowing they were likely to die in the hijackings, the men made little attempt to cover their tracks. The plot was masterminded by Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian-born architect who took flying lessons with the other hijackers over a period of several months. They were mostly Saudi-born middle-class men who had become radicalized due to their anger at U.S. policy in the Middle East. The terrorists were groomed by al-Qaeda, an extremist organization founded by Saudi millionaire Osama bin Laden, who provided the $500,000 required to carry out the attacks. The 19 men took flight from Boston, Virginia, and New Jersey. Once the aircraft were in the air, they used box-cutter knives and chemical spray to kill and injure flight crew and gain control of the cockpits. The hijackers told passengers they had bombs, although no explosives were found at the crash sites. A year after 9/11, a commission was set up to probe the attacks and find out why the United States intelligence community failed to prevent them. Presenting its report in 2004, the commission identified a number of failings on the part of the FBI and CIA. However, although 15 of the 19 attackers were Saudi citizens, it found the Saudi government played no part in the terrorist acts. In response to the attacks, U.S. authorities tightened security at airports and federal buildings. But some people reacted hysterically, with reports of Muslim travelers being victimized and people accosted by security for just reading books with the word fundamentalism in the title. Nearly 3,000 people died on September 11, including more than 400 emergency workers, but only 1,600 people could be positively identified. Thousands more were injured. Others have suffered permanently debilitating conditions from the toxic material they were exposed to at Ground Zero. A memorial designed by architect Michael Arad, made up of reflecting pools and a forest of trees, will be built on the site of the towers to honor those who lost their lives in the attacks. There's no doubt September 11 is a day that the world will never forget. Coming up, high-level spying. Spies, top-secret technology, and an all-American hero. The U-2 spy plane incident was the quintessential Cold War story, and it rocked US-Soviet relations for decades. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane was developed by the CIA to provide high-altitude photographs of secret Russian military installations. On the 9th of April 1960, the first mission returned with images of a nuclear test site and air bases. The Soviets detected the flight and made a diplomatic protest. President Eisenhower forbade any further flights without his personal permission. However, on May the 1st, he allowed pilot Francis Gary Powers to fly another mission to photograph intercontinental ballistic missile sites. But the Soviets were waiting. They captured both Powers, who bailed out of his aircraft after losing control under anti-aircraft fire, and the wreckage of the spy plane. After losing touch with the aircraft, the Americans believed it had crashed into Soviet territory, taking the pilot with it. The Russians were delighted. With its high-tech spy flights and refusal to abide by international treaties, the Americans had been getting the upper hand. Now the Russians held all the cards. Khrushchev kept quiet about his catch, allowing the Americans to make public statements claiming the aircraft had been making weather observations for NASA and even rolling out a U-2 in NASA insignia so the media could take photographs. A few days later, the secret slipped out when the deputy foreign minister was overheard talking about the pilot's interrogation. Khrushchev quickly issued a public statement saying, "I must tell you a secret. When I made my first report, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. And now just look how many silly things the Americans have said." The Soviets shocked Americans by parading pilot Gary Powers as a captured spy. Much of the U-2 had crashed to Earth intact, and they even had photographs from the spy plane that proved it was spying on Soviet territory. Items salvaged from the wreckage included rubles and women's jewelry, intended to help the pilot if he landed in enemy territory. The aircraft and its contents were put on display at Moscow's Gorky Park to humiliate the Americans. Gary Powers went on trial for espionage, a huge and very public event. Some Americans criticized him for cooperating with Russian authorities during his interrogation. However, the CIA's instructions were clear. If capture appears imminent, pilots should surrender without resistance and adopt a cooperative attitude towards their captors. With Powers' concerned family looking on, a Russian court found him guilty of espionage and sentenced him to 3 years imprisonment, followed by 7 years hard labor. Returning from Russia after the trial, Powers' father told reporters he'd been relieved to find his son safe and well. He said it had been a tense and exhausting time, but the family was happy to see their son, and he appreciated the courtesy and consideration shown by the Russians. But telling of his son's one modest request, Oliver Powers broke down.
Once again, he didn't ask us for anything specific. He said he needed warm clothing for winter.
Finally, 2 years after Powers' capture, there was a breakthrough.
Francis Gary Powers has been released from prison in the Soviet Union and turned over to American authorities early this morning in Berlin. Frederick L. Pryor, an American student held by East German authorities since August of 1961, also has been turned over to American authorities in Berlin. The president has commuted the sentence of Rudolf Abel, who has been serving a 30-year sentence in federal prison following his conviction in 1957 on espionage charges. Mr. Abel has been deported and has been released in Berlin. Mr. Powers will shortly be en route to the United States. He will have an opportunity to meet privately with his family and will be interviewed by appropriate United States government officials.
In 1957,
British-born Soviet spy Rudolf Abel returned to Moscow, and his family wrote Powers' parents a letter of thanks that was published in a Russian newspaper. Oliver Powers was delighted and relieved that their ordeal was finally over, but said he hoped his son would consider a career change when he returned home.
How do you feel about the exchange itself?
I feel great about that exchange. I think it's a very good deed.
What are your own views about flying at this point? Would you like to see him do any more?
I'd rather he'd quit that and not get above the second story.
Powers' wife Barbara was equally happy.
Wonderful news.
Oh, well, you just don't know. It's wonderful.
Mrs. Powers, how did you first get word this morning? What form did it take?
Well, a representative from the president called me. He told me that my husband was on his way home. And I almost fell out. I was so happy.
Was this the first word that you had had?
Yes.
Well, this then came as a complete surprise to you.
Oh, my goodness. I just cried for joy, and I still am.
Powers was interviewed by a Senate committee when he returned, which found he'd behaved in an exemplary fashion and acquitted himself as a fine young man under dangerous circumstances. Powers died in 1977 in a helicopter crash, and 40 years after the U-2 spy incident, his family was presented with a Prisoner of War Medal, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and a CIA Director's Medal. Today, the remains of the U-2 wreck can be seen at the Central Museum of Armed Forces in Moscow, a permanent reminder of one of the most riveting episodes of the Cold War. Coming up, a Caribbean cricket mystery. In 1961, Lester Piggott's wedding to Susan Armstrong was front-page news. The 26-year-old jockey was the darling of the British racing industry, a phenomenal rider who won his first race at just 12 years of age. At 5 foot 8 inches, Piggott was unusually tall for a jockey and usually rode at 8 stone. Early in his career, his precocious talent and unorthodox riding habits brought him unwelcome attention from local stewards, who suspended him several times, often unfairly. But as his wins mounted, Piggott reached the top of his profession, notching up no fewer than 9 Epsom Derbies and a staggering 5,300 wins overall. With success came a certain insolence, and Piggott delighted in bucking authority, famously snatching a whip from a fellow jockey during a race at Deauville after his own went flying. However, his disregard for the law came back to haunt him in 1987 when he was jailed for 3 years for tax fraud. Piggott, who was worth an estimated £20 million at the time, was convicted of failing to declare more than £3 million of riding and horse breeding income. The racing world was shocked at the sentence, which the judge said was necessary because of the scale of the evasion and the importance of sending a strong message to others who might have been tempted to do the same. Piggott served a year in jail before being released early for good behavior. Cricket legend Bob Woolmer excelled throughout his career, first as a world-class batsman, then as one of the world's greatest coaches. But his death on the 18th of May 2007 left authorities mystified. The 58-year-old Briton was found unconscious in his hotel room the day after his team, Pakistan, had been unexpectedly eliminated from the Cricket World Cup.
The pathologist's report states that Mr. Woolmer's death was due to asphyxia as a result of manual strangulation. In these circumstances, the matter of Mr. Woolmer's death is now being treated by the Jamaica Police as a case of murder.
The results of the autopsy carried out by Dr. Iris Esaya confirmed Woolmer had met with foul play. But there was no evidence of theft or forced entry. Police were left with few leads. There was speculation that the death could be linked to his strong opposition to match fixing. Woolmer's death completely overshadowed the World Cup being played in the Caribbean and plunged the cricket world into mourning. Police Commissioner Mark Shields warned it would be a lengthy investigation due to the amount of people to be scrutinised.
If you consider the CCTV alone, the time that Bob Woolmer went to his bedroom, to his room, to the time that he was found dead is some significant period of time. So to go through each of the CCTV on the floor, for the 12th floor, frame by frame, if we're to do our jobs properly, there is going to be no instant result. We have to be methodical and thorough in terms of trying to identify every single person who was on that floor between those times. So please be patient, because we are not going to rush this. We're going to do it properly, thoroughly and professionally.
Questions were raised about an email Woolmer sent his wife the day before he died.
But the reality is that computers do not necessarily synchronise to local time, so we're still working on that. What I can tell you is that we have Bob Woolmer's computer, and we're looking at what's on the hard drive in order that we can see if there's anything else to establish a motive.
But the Commissioner said it was far too early in the investigation to be naming suspects.
The British press are totally wrong on this occasion, with all due respect, and that they should wait for announcements from us, because I think we know if there are any suspects. The reality is, as I've said before, there are many potential suspects in this investigation and even more potential witnesses, and we're nowhere near the stage at the moment to start naming names in terms of suspects. All we have to do is keep an open mind, continue with the investigation, and at any moment in the future when I have suspects and I can announce it, I'll tell you. It would take some force, because Bob was a large man, and therefore it would have taken some significant force in which to subdue him and cause strangulation. But of course we do not know at this stage how many people were in the room.
Are you suggesting that there might be, sorry, follow-up, are you suggesting there might be more than one person involved?
As the press statement said, yes, it could be one or more people that were involved in this murder.
Officials urged anyone with information to come forward, while a local journalist said he believed the murderer was definitely someone known to Woolmer, as the hotel room was highly secure.
This is a very busy hotel, which at the time of Bob's murder was fully occupied. There are many members of staff, guests, other officials and visitors who were in the hotel, and I'm absolutely positive that on Sunday evening after the game against Ireland, somebody or some people have some vital information that they should give to us by calling the number that was mentioned earlier on.
It has very serious implications for Jamaica, given our reputation, our high crime rate, our reputation for a lot of murders. But the comforting thing to me is that from a layman's point of view, it seems to have been somebody who was close to Mr. Woolmer, or persons who were close to Mr. Woolmer, who carried out this dastardly act. There was no sign of forced entry. None of his belongings were missing. So that says a lot to me. Knowing the Pegasus, it takes someone with a security card to get onto a floor. So it had to be someone who knew Mr. Woolmer, who he let into his room, that did this act.
However, as the investigation progressed, doubt grew about the circumstances of Woolmer's death. A British forensic expert found that the cricket coach had died of natural causes, but a jury convened for his inquest in November 2007 gave an open verdict, refusing to rule out the controversial strangulation theory.
Three.